Hi, everyone, and welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, a podcast where our goal is to read the entire Bible in a year, seeking to understand God's plan of redemption while discovering daily and practically your part in it.
All right, guys, we only have 5 more days to complete the entire Bible, so that's fairly exciting. Today, we might be doing the shortest episode we've ever done. I don't know. I guess it depends on how much we decide to talk about this. Today, we're looking at 2nd and 3rd John, and you might think, wow, they're doing 2 whole books. It ends up being like 4 whole pages, I think, and that's with half the pages taken up by notes at the bottom. So these are very, very small letters from John. The first one is to a church. The second one is to an individual person. Let's see if we have anything to talk about with these 2.
Yeah, really. I think there's less than 30 verses across the entire 2 books. I was telling Ryan, why even bother send this letter? Like, this is so weird. You could just speak to someone, tell them what you want to say. But I guess something that stuck out to me was in 3rd John, the book of 3rd John. That sounds weird to say.
Can we do a quick little tease there? Because I think we pretty much both want to talk about 3rd John. 2nd John, in case you're wondering, it starts out saying, to the elect lady and her children. Don't be confused. That's not an actual lady and her actual children.
It's like the church.
This is how they referred to churches. So if you hear that and you're like, wait a minute, what's going on here?
Is that like bride reference? Like the bride, the church is Christ's bride kind of deal?
Yeah, and it's common they would call each other brother and sister. So that's what's going on there. This is not like some kind of scandalous Da Vinci Code situation where we've stumbled onto some truth that nobody knew. It's just a very short letter to a church saying, hey, continue to walk in the love that has been commanded to you. It's a lot of the same stuff we read prior in 1 John. So probably the most powerful pointed thing that I see in 2 John is verse 6. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, so that you should walk in it. So how do we show love? We follow Christ's commandments. We talked about that yesterday. This is one of the ways that we know the same person wrote these letters, is because this is very, very similar language, this time to a different church.
So I feel like
he's just encouraging them.
You could probably have said, like, you should have put 2nd John as 1 John to be like the weird preview beforehand, because it literally feels like the abstract to a very long paper. That's what 2nd John felt like. Okay,
Jenny's
we talked about
direct
this.
quote is like, why didn't he just save the postage? He wouldn't have had to send us some.
It's so weird. Anyway,
I don't know how much a Roman stamp costs.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about that. So anyway, we kept moving on to 3rd John, and the only thing that stuck out to me in both of these books really was talk of this specific person, and I hate his name because I can't say it right. It's like Diotrephes.
Diotrephes, maybe? Yeah.
Sure. But this was like an obvious person that was not necessarily in support of the church and its mission of like missionaries spreading the word, because in the time, the only way for the church to actually be able to survive and continue to grow was for Christian missionaries to take the message and spread it. So with people being like moving from church to church, coming around, encouraging one another and continuing to spread the gospel, there was actually this person, Diotrephes, who was not supportive of those people coming, to the point of not even like letting them into the church at times, talking really poorly of them, and even just like completely excommunicating them from anything within his church or ministry, which is so silly. But I think we can see that today. Like, he really thought highly of himself. He was like gossipy about them, and just not great.
Something interesting here to call out. This is a little bit unique, and it's definitely worth looking at. So don't hear us kind of being like, oh, this isn't very long, and not read it. It is worth a read.
Yeah.
This is a fellow believer. So this is kind of a unique letter in that he is not necessarily calling out false teaching. He's not necessarily calling out blatant sin. He's calling out a fellow believer, most likely in the same body of believers in the same church, that is not making wise choices and good decisions. There's a lot of different takes on who this Diotrephes guy is. But the most common thread is that they are most likely part of the same church, if not the same church, like neighboring churches. And he's a believer. He's a guy that is trying to follow Jesus, but is missing the mark a little bit.
Well, and something that, like, it doesn't explicitly say what his actual deal is outside of just being very unwelcoming and speaking very poorly of other missionaries that are coming through. But to me, it almost feels like this is the guy that thinks he's got it all right. He knows everything about what the church should be doing. And if he's not the center of attention, or he's not the one coming up with the ideas or making the moves or whatever, then it feels like he doesn't want to have to deal with anybody else because he's the one that's in charge and in the limelight, no one else. That's the vibe I'm getting.
Okay, so there's been some scholarship done on this, and it is really interesting. Now, again, we don't know a lot about this guy from the text.
Mm-hmm.
Like the biggest thing we know is that he likes to put himself first.
Right.
And if you're familiar with the message of Scripture, that's not a great thing to be written about you. But there are a couple things that we can discern and kind of try to, as wisely as possible, deal with what's going on here.
Also, just to add to that before you keep going, it also says in that same verse 9, and he does not acknowledge our authority.
Yeah,
so, like,
correct.
Either at the same level and not, like, working together, or these guys are even more, like, leaders are more in charge, and he's, like, not even recognizing them as that.
So the first case that I don't find as compelling is that his name, Diotrephes, is a pretty rare name. Gaius is very common. John is pretty common. Diotrephes is very specific, and it was really only used among very rich, affluent Greek people. And so one theory is that because this guy very likely was a rich, affluent Greek person, he just didn't want to put up with other people who he saw as less important than himself. This would have been a hard social shift for him to listen to these poor people talking about Jesus. And that would be why he would like to put himself first. He was used to it. The other case that I think is far more compelling is that John is writing this kind of at the end of the apostolic age. So we talked about yesterday how this is one of the later letters. I think these letters are written around 80 or 90 AD. The reason those dates are important is because the actual apostles, the men who learned directly from Jesus, they are beginning to die off. I mean, in fact, they're beginning to be killed off. And leadership is being handed over to the next generation of believers who didn't learn from Jesus. They learned from people who learned from Jesus. So actually what you'll see in history, and this is maybe Bible nerdy, but what you'll see throughout history is this second like the second round of leaders in the Christian church, they were disciples of the apostles. So the apostles actually did what Jesus did. They took on a couple of people to teach and help them discern how to lead, and those people led the church. So a lot of people think that Diotrephes is not super into the way that this is going down. He doesn't want to be under one of John's disciples. He wants to be in charge. And so there literally is like a leadership vacuum because a lot of the apostles have already died, and they're trying to fill that leadership vacuum. And you see Diotrephes saying, like, this is my shot. Like, I want to be in charge of this joint. And that's the tension that's coming up.
Well, I think that's interesting, too, because I've seen that a lot in my own day and age, unfortunately. And I think that happens all across churches. It's not unique to the United States. That can be a really awful and ugly thing that can just creep in. And I think this is a really good example of that, because the next couple of verses, verse 11 says, "Beloved, do not imitate evil, but imitate good." I think this is just like a serious callback to that. Like, don't be like this guy. Yes, he's in charge, but it's clear that his motivations are not pure and they're not good. So I think it's a good, even though not all of us are in leadership positions within the church, it's a good reminder to us, like, don't make it about yourself.
It is really interesting how that unchecked selfish ambition has been around since the very beginning. Jesus' disciples argued among themselves who was the best. I think, again, it's a little bit of a reach, but I think we can say that Diotrephes was trying to make this all about himself. We know that also was occurring in other cities because they were really fighting against this model that was being formed of leaders who were the right leaders. And I'm sure you see that. Probably you've seen that, I don't know, maybe in your job, maybe in your church. But leadership vacuums created by leadership turnovers, it's a really shaky spot to be because selfish ambition can just run wild. And what happens is the focus comes off of Jesus and ends up on our own individual selves. And every time that happens, we're presenting a much less flattering picture of Jesus, and it's not a good thing.
So just this, I think, is a good year apart from our study Bible, is like this overall theme of 3rd John is that despite opposition or despite things that come up, like this guy, Diotrephes, John reminds us to be faithful and not to imitate those types of things, but to imitate good things that glorify God and his kingdom. So no matter where you may come in contact with a person like Diotrephes, remember to, in the words of John, like remain faithful and strong to what God wants and not the evil things that unfortunately people fall into sometimes.
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us today. We are going to enter into Revelation tomorrow. Dun, dun, dun. See you then.
Thanks so much for listening to God's Plan, Your Part. If anything stuck out to you, if you have any questions, or if you'd like to receive a Bible, you can email us at godsplанyourpart@gmail.com. Also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please consider supporting us through the link in our description. We love that you're on this journey with us, and we hope you have a great day. See you tomorrow.